Today, we're looking into two stories about untimely fates. The only thing I can say about these stories is that they're extremely thought-provoking. Every one of us is guilty of being caught up in our own lives, and at one point or another, we've forgotten that any choice we make could turn any day into our last. Viewer discretion is advised. In the year 1901, Frank Hayes was born in Ireland and eventually moved to New York. Not much is known about his early life. However, one thing always had a grip on his mind: horse racing. Frank dreamed of becoming a jockey and making a name for himself in the exhilarating world of horse racing. Frank's journey wasn't easy. He worked tirelessly as an exercise rider and trainer, honing his skills and immersing himself in the world of horses. He loved what he did, and there was something weighing on him. He couldn't shake the fact that one race after another went by while the jockeys would soak up the fame, and Frank could only quietly bring the horses back after each race, and he went completely unnoticed. Though he had limited experience as a professional jockey, Frank was determined. He believed in his abilities and held on to a glimmer of hope that one day his moment of glory would finally arrive. And just like that, on one fateful day in 1923, Frank Hayes got his chance. The stage was set at Belmont Park, one of the most prestigious racetracks in New York, and as if it were a dream, Frank was asked to be a stand-in jockey for an upcoming race. He was ecstatic. This was everything that he had been waiting for. This was his chance to prove once and for all that he could compete with the other jockeys. So of course, he accepted. He was scheduled to ride a horse named Sweet Kiss in a steeplechase race, which is usually between 2 and 4.5 miles long and requires racers to jump over a variety of obstacles including fences, water jumps, or open ditches. The day before the race, jockeys were required to weigh in, but there was a problem. Frank didn't meet the requirement. At 142 pounds, he was 12 pounds over the 130-pound weight limit. Frank was so close to his dream coming true. There was no way he was going to let this opportunity slip by without a fight. But with only 24 hours to work with, he was going to have to really work to make this happen. Frank's plan was to run continuously and drop 12 pounds of water weight before the race the next day. His determination took over and he ran the rest of the night and into the morning. The main drawback to this plan was that he wasn't even eating or drinking water because he didn't want the extra weight on him until after weigh-ins the next day. But he was not losing this opportunity. The next day, on June 4th, Frank showed up to the track, and this was the moment of truth. Does he get to race, or does this become another lost chance to make his dreams come true? As he stepped up, he waited, and then he let out a sigh of relief. He did it. He made the cut. Today, he's gonna race Sweet Kiss. He was so excited, but things were just beginning. The race came closer and closer, and Frank was nervous, excited, and everything in between. He could feel his adrenaline pumping at the thought of bringing Sweet Kiss across the finish line for a first place win, and finally getting the recognition he had worked for all this time. Frank was ready and lined up with the rest of the horses. He could hear the crowd, and he knew that they were all watching. And all of a sudden, the gun sounded, signaling the beginning of the race. The pounding hooves and the thunderous cheers of the crowd filled the air. The spectators watched with excitement as Frank skillfully guided Sweet Kiss through the obstacles, inching closer and closer to victory. Frank took a look around and he couldn't believe it. He was actually doing it. He was so close he couldn't focus on anything else. And then it happened. Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line and Frank had won the race, and the crowd erupted in joy and celebration. But when the crowd rushed up to Frank to give him the praise and recognition he'd always wanted, they made a horrifying discovery. You see, prior to the race, Frank had significant cardiovascular problems, but he never brought it to anyone's attention because he was afraid it would keep him from fulfilling his dream of becoming a famous jockey. The adrenaline of the race, mixed with the fact that he'd lost so much weight and refused to replenish his body beforehand, bore too much of a strain on him. During the race, Frank had succumbed to a fatal heart attack. Amazingly though, he he was able to position himself in a way that would allow him to hold onto the reins and stay on top of Sweet Kiss even past the finish line. So when the crowd approached him to congratulate him on his well-deserved victory, Frank was dead. Spectators had to take a moment to take in what happened. The moment that Frank had worked his entire life for finally came, but he was never able to bask in his accomplishment. Frank became the first person to ever win a race after his death. Sweet Kiss took on the nickname Sweet Kiss of Death and was retired from racing after the event. Due to the superstitious nature of racing, no other jockeys would race Sweet Kiss out of fear that they would meet the same fate as Frank Hayes. Around Christmas time in 2002, a man named Kyle McGarity was working at a restaurant in Manhattan in New York City. He was described as a very friendly person by patrons of his workplace, and he was even described as sweet-spirited and a friend to everybody. A good friend of Kyle's named Keith Masters lived right down the hall in the same apartment building. The age difference between the two might have seemed odd, as Kyle was only 25 and Keith was 27, but they got along just the same. One night, after working a double shift, Kyle returned to his apartment building and ran into Keith and his girlfriend in the hall just before entering his apartment. Keith and his girlfriend were getting ready to go out for drinks that night, and they ended up inviting Kyle to join them. Kyle thought it was perfect. This is exactly what he needed after a long day, so he headed into his apartment, changed his clothes, and headed out with Keith and Keith's girlfriend, ready to have a good time and cut loose for the weekend. The three went bar hopping around Lower Manhattan, and the night was fun and went smoothly overall. But when it had gotten pretty late, close to about 4 a.m., the three decided to call it a night and head home. It was a good time to make the decision because the bar that they were at was only a couple of blocks away from the apartment building where the two lived, so it was a pretty easy walk for them. But this is where things took a turn. Keith and his girlfriend had started to argue a bit, and in a few minutes, it started to get heated. In an attempt to break up the argument, Kyle decided to intervene on her behalf and put his arm around her. This infuriated Keith, and he became convinced that Kyle was flirting with his girlfriend. It's unclear whether there had been any flirting before this, or if Kyle was only acting in a friendly manner, but either way, Keith started to attack Kyle over it, right in the street. Keith charged Kyle from behind and wrapped him up, and then pinned him against a wall. Kyle broke free and the two continued the scuffle on the ground, rolling around wildly. The street was filled with steam at the time, so nobody could tell what was happening. That is, until screams were heard. Kyle ended up falling 18 feet into a manhole. Keith almost followed him down too, except he was able to catch himself and pull himself back up above the surface of the street. Kyle wasn't just screaming because he was trapped though. He learned at that moment that the steam covering the street that night had a source, and he was now standing in it. There was a steam main buried below the street, and it was leaking, so the steam was being vented through that very same manhole. Paramedics arrived, but they were initially unable to help. They could hear screams, but when they leaned over to try and get a view of Kyle, they were just hit by steam and couldn't see past it. Eventually, they were able to get a clear look into the hole, and what they saw was terrifying. Kyle was standing waist deep in boiling water, and it was clear that he was in excruciating pain. At this point, they needed to think fast if they wanted to have any chance of getting Kyle back up to the surface alive. They came up with a plan to lower things down to Kyle that he could grab onto, and then they'd pull him up out of the hole. But this didn't quite work. By this time, the damage to his body, plus the exhaustion, must have made Kyle extremely weak because he couldn't hold on to anything long enough to be pulled out of the water. Plan B was to lower somebody down to Kyle, strap a harness around him, and pull him up that way. But there was still an issue. The manhole was too hot for anyone else to attempt it. The temperature was still over 300 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Panic was setting in for the team of rescuers. This was now not only a torturous situation for Kyle, but also for anyone who was trying to help. Kyle was in view of everyone, and if it wasn't for the heat, it would have been a relatively easy rescue. But the reality of the situation started to hit everyone involved. Kyle's screams were filling the air, and nobody was able to enter or pull Kyle to safety. After a while longer, the screams stopped. Everyone knew what that meant, and Kyle's suffering was finally over. It still took over 4 hours to retrieve Kyle's body from the manhole because nobody could attempt anything until it had cooled off. Kyle's body was recorded at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. However, it was thought to be much higher because their thermometers topped out at 125 degrees. The most terrifying part of the entire ordeal came during the autopsy, when it was revealed just how badly Kyle had been injured during the ordeal. It was so bad that it appeared that Kyle had been steamed like a lobster. He suffered from severe burns on over 60% of his body. His skin had peeled off completely, and his organs were literally cooked. Thank you all for watching, and before you go, I'm always combing through new stories, true crime, and anything morbid or mysterious. But just because it's a new story to me doesn't mean that it's a new story to all of you. So if you've got any suggestions for lesser known stories, I'd love to hear them in the comments. This is Fearbank, and I'll see you next time.